Y'all here, and it's getting into chapter 7 today. Romans chapter 7 is what we're going to be studying. We're going to read through, we're going to do a little bit different today. I'm going to read the first 15 verses. The first 15 verses, I'll go back and talk about those 15 verses, and then we will do maybe the first 16. We're going to do 17 through the rest of the chapter after that, and I'll go back and talk about that. There's a lot in this chapter that pertains to the old law, and a lot of stuff in here that he's still trying to separate the gospel from that law, and they're still just not quite understanding. So at the beginning of this chapter, he starts trying to use a comparison of something that they know, something that they understand, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Let's go ahead and read down through verse 16. Or do you not know, brethren, for I am speaking to those who know the law, that the law has jurisdiction over a person as long as he lives? For the married woman is bound by law to her husband while he is living. But if her husband dies, she is released from the law concerning the husband. So then, if while her husband is living she is joined to another man, she shall be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress, though she is joined to another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also were made to die to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might be joined to another, to him who was raised from the dead, in order that we might bear fruit for God. For while we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in the members of our body to bear fruit for death. But now we have been released from the law, having died to that by which we were bound, so that we serve in newness of the Spirit and not in oldness of the letter. What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law, for I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind. For apart from the law, sin is dead. I was once alive apart from the law. But when the commandment came, sin became alive, and I died. And this commandment, which was to result in life, proved to result in death for me. For sin, taking an opportunity through the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me. So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, and the righteous is good. Therefore did that which is good become a cause of death for me? May it never be. Rather it was sin, in order that it might be shown to be sin by affecting my death through that which is good, so that through the commandment sin will become utterly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am of flesh, sold into bondage to sin. For what I am doing I do not understand, for what I am not practicing what I would like to do, but I am doing the very thing I hate. But if I do the very thing I do not want to do, I agree with the law, confessing that the law is good. So he starts out this chapter, and he's trying to find a comparison that he can use to show them what it means, how you died to that old law. And they understand about marriage. They understand that bond from a woman and a man is to death. They understand that, so he uses that as the analogy. Is that true? Yes. Do they know that? Yes. They understand that. So he's showing them, just as a woman being married is bound to the covenant that she made and that they made together, they're bound to that covenant. But if one dies, they're not bound to that covenant any longer. They know that. So he's showing them that the old law was the same way. You were married to that old law, but that old law is gone. You're dead to that old law now. They were still having that same issue. They were still trying to go back and forth, trying to obey the gospel and the old law at the same time. So he's trying to give them that distinction again, which he's already done several times through Romans, through this letter that he's written to them. He's done several times to show that distinction. And people don't understand that the old law, they don't understand the old law was flawed. There was no forgiveness in that old law. The sinful nature that he speaks about was in the flesh, that he was in that old law where the sin was taken over. He could not deliver that old law the way it needed to be done, right? He couldn't live up to that standard. He'll talk about that more later. But in the old law, one sin in 1 year away from that law was death. And he's explaining that to them. And he's trying to explain, just like I told you before, their questions he keeps being asked is, well, what do you mean if the old law, are you saying that it was no good, it was good for nothing? He's saying no, the old law was there for a reason. The old law showed us what? It introduced sin. It showed us what sin was. As I talked about before, when you get something new or something happens to you even, say that you get a sickness, an illness that's a lifelong illness that you're going to have forever. And you see this a lot with people. A family member gets ill and they get a disease that they're going to carry with them for the rest of their life. All of a sudden, you become more aware of it. You become more aware of what's around you. You become more aware of other people that have this. You become more aware and you get more involved in that, right? So you see people, breast cancer is a big thing, right? Breast cancer. When somebody gets, you may not think about it at all, but somebody in your family gets it, all of a sudden it goes to the top of your list. You start seeing it. You start seeing more people and more people. You become aware. You get involved. That's what the old law did for sin. It made them aware of that sin. They were aware. They knew what sin was, because without it, they wouldn't have known, thou shalt not covet, which he said, I would have never known that had it not been for the law. So the law served its purpose. It served the purpose of showing you right and wrong. It did that. It served that purpose. The problem was the old law was a fleshly law that you had to live up to, that you had to do certain things every single day of your life, and you had to live up to these works, and no man could do it. In the flesh, you couldn't do it. It was a flawed law. There was no forgiveness. There was only Passover. The new law is offering that forgiveness so that you don't have just that one time that you slip up doesn't make you a sinner for life. You understand where I'm going? It's that sin now you can have forgiveness for it. Jesus allowed that opportunity for that forgiveness. And that's where Paul's trying to get them over to that area. That's why he opens this up with, I'm speaking to those that know the law. He's talking to the ones that know the old law, that they know what was going on. They knew what they were doing, because that's where he's going to get his distinction. And most of the Romans letter is for the benefit of the Jews that were under that old law. It's written for our benefit. We can read it. We can see that distinction where he's making that divide. But when we get in later in this chapter, he starts giving another part of this, that he starts showing why that old law was flawed. Even in himself, where it was flawed. So in those first 16 verses, he's still using those same words again, because again, he's writing a letter. He's not there telling them this. And as I said before, when you're writing a letter and you write it down and somebody gets your letter and they read it, they don't get the same effect as it would be if they're standing in front of you talking to you. And he knew that. That's why Paul used certain phrases that he used, so they would understand the importance, the magnitude of what he was saying. God forbid. May it never be. Those are things that in that time were very influential. They were rarely said. Unlike today, they've taken things today in the world, you'll see phrases like that all the time. In this time, that wasn't something that was normal. So when they saw that, they were made aware, okay, he's serious about this. This is something we got to pay attention to, because he didn't have that face-to-face. He was writing it in a letter, so he had to use stronger terms and stronger phrases to make them understand. Just like I was talking about last week, when you send a text to somebody, the person on the other end can't see your intent of that text. They don't understand what your level of excitement or your level of disdain is. They don't know. They could take your text and misconstrue it however they wanted to. And that's what Paul's trying to keep from happening in this letter. In all of Paul's letters, he writes them that way because he wasn't going to be there right then to be face-to-face with them. He's not talking to them directly. Sometimes we get caught in that. We'll write something down. We'll post something somewhere, and it gets taken out of context of what we meant, of no fault of the person that read it. And it's no fault of the person that wrote it. It's just how it is, because there's no level of personal thing there, no personal touch there. So we can get into that trap as well. So Paul's trying to make sure that doesn't happen, first and foremost. That's when he gets to that, may it never be, God forbid. That's why he uses those phrases. So we can see that he's trying to make that distinction again. And he's going through, and when you get into verse 6, I think it's verse 7, sorry. It says, "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? May it never be. On the contrary, I would not have come to know sin except through the law, for I would not have known about coveting if the law had not said, you shall not covet." So same thing before. That made you aware. Verse 8 says, But sin, taking opportunity through the commandment, produced in me coveting of every kind, for apart from the law, sin is dead. So he's taking that distinction again, saying, okay, when you get away from that law, the new gospel's coming in, you're dead to that life. You're dead to that law, you're dead to that sin. As we are today, when we are baptized in water and resurrected as that new man, we're dead to that old man. As I made the analogy last week about driving to the old house where I used to live, I don't live there anymore. Same thing now. That's what he's explaining to them again. You don't live in that law anymore. It's gone. It's dead. Those sins are gone. You've been made new. Stop going back to that life. Stop going back to that law. They were still trying to obey two laws. And he's telling them now, in this chapter, that you're dead to that. It's done. That law is finished. Even though some of that old law comes over into the gospel, the works of that old law are dead. So we know that the commandments, most of the commandments, they come right on over to the gospel. A lot of the things come over into the gospel, but the works don't. It's not needed anymore. Don't need that sacrifice because Christ was the ultimate sacrifice. So that's all gone. Paul's trying to bring that over. In those first 16 verses, that's his explanation. And when you get into verse 14 through 16 there, you're kind of looking at the two different natures, right? We're trying to get through the conflict of the two. The spiritual side and the fleshly side. When we get through in here, when we start reading 17 through the rest of this chapter, it gets a little more confusing, I would say. For some, it does get more confusing because Paul starts talking in terms that you may not understand. He starts using words that you may not understand because he starts combining and talking about the flesh, and he starts talking about the spirit, and he starts talking about the fleshly man. He starts saying that I am, I was, all of these things we're going to read here in just a minute. And it can get I don't want to say confusing, because I don't think that anything in the Scripture is really confusing, but if you don't take it for the whole of what it is, if you don't read everything for what it is, if you don't read the entire story of the Bible, you can take some things out of context in the next several verses that can make things seem different than they really are. That we've been through Romans now. We started in chapter 1 and we're all the way down to chapter 7. Those first 6 chapters explain a lot of what he's going to talk about in 17 through the rest of this chapter. So, but if you take it as it is, the next several verses are used in the world today, in denominations in the world today, to try to tell us that man is inherently evil, that we inherited Adam's sin, that children come into this world as sinners. A lot of this stuff that you hear, they try to use this as proof text, because they take just the little areas that they want to take. They rebuild the chapter, and there you go. They don't take it for what it is through the entire book of Romans. So having said that, let's start here. We're going to read on down. We're going to read the rest of the chapter, starting in verse 17. So now, no longer am I the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. For I, knowing that nothing good dwells in me, that is, in my flesh, for the willing is present in me, but the doing of the good is not. For the good that I want, I do not do, but I practice the very evil that I do not want. But if I am doing the very thing I do not want, I am no longer the one doing it, but sin which dwells in me. I find then the principle that evil is present in me, the one who wants to do good. For I joyfully concur with the law of God in the inner man, but I see a different law in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin which is in my members. Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from the body of this death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself, with my mind, am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. So you can see how someone could take that, manipulate it, not use any other supporting areas, and take that and make it seem like there is an evil that's in you always, that's been there since Adam. That's what they try to claim there, and that's where there's a distinction made. And all Paul's trying to do here is show that when I was myself and I was following my heart in the old law, sin had reigned. He's not saying that he's not responsible for his sins, because just before that he just stated that he's not. The very thing I do, he knows, he understands that it's sin there in that old law. He's not speaking of in terms of what he's doing now. He's trying to show them that old law still. He's trying to say, you see what I was doing, even persecuting Christians. He was doing that to serve God, what he thought was right. He thought that he was serving that old law by doing those things.
I'll tell you, Paul was known for doing that to the Scriptures. Like, you notice in verse 24, "Oh, wretched man that I am." It's several times throughout the Scriptures, and even other times he said, "I was the chief of sinners." And it's almost like, I mean, I guess if I had done those things as well, you know, that would haunt me in my dreams, that I would constantly remind myself, hey, how pitiful I am. It's like he always does that. He makes himself pitiful, and he raises up the Lord and says, look how great he is. And I really believe that's what he's doing there too.
Oh yeah, he's showing them that, look how bad I was. Look how bad I was, and even I am dead to that. And it's twofold, because not only are we dead to that sin, but that sin is dead to Christ in us. Right? So now that I'm dead to that old life, I'm dead to that sinful way that I was, Christ doesn't see it on us anymore either. God doesn't hold us accountable for that anymore either. That's important to know, because people in the world today, I've heard people say that God can't save me. Of all the evil things I've done, all the evil I've done in my life, there's no way that God would have pity on me and be able to save me. But that's not true, and that's what Paul is a prime example for. And I think that's why God used Paul the way he did, to show that you see this man, all of the things that he did, he was forgiven for through Christ. Which means that whatever you've done, whatever sin that you've had in your life, the bad that you did, the evil, the wicked things that you did or you've done, they can be forgiven through Christ. Paul's making that known, that this gospel saved him from that evil. This new gospel saved him from the war that he waged in that old law. That this new gospel, this new way, was offering even him salvation. Even he could be saved. And I promise you that the people that are the audience or the receivers of this letter knew Paul when he was Saul. They knew the evil that Paul had done. How do we know that? Because if you look back in Acts, when Ananias was told to go to Paul, he was scared. He was frightened. He was frightened. He was scared of Paul. The new Christians were scared of Paul. They knew his history. They knew what he had done. And that's part of the letter from Paul here to Rome, is explaining to them, you know me. You know what I've done, and the gospel has saved me. That's powerful. It's powerful in many ways. It's powerful because it's coming from Paul, which is a very knowledgeable man that had the Spirit working through him. They understood that. It's powerful in that way, as well as it's powerful coming from a sinner such as he was. So you see right there, it says, for I know, he knows that it's him. It's not something that he's not responsible for. He understands he's given that personal responsibility when he says, I know. He's not trying to get out of something that he did. He's not trying to get out of anything here. He's not trying to pawn it off on somebody else. He's taking full responsibility for what he's done, for what he himself knew. He never tries. That's one thing Paul never does. Paul never takes his sin and tries to place it on somebody else. He never says that I did this because. He never says I did this but. We hear that sometimes, don't we, when somebody makes an apology or they say they're sorry for something. I'm sorry I did that, but I'm sorry I hit you in the eye, but you kind of made me do that. right? So you see that a lot, and Paul doesn't ever take that approach. He never takes that, but you did something to me that made me do it. I've heard confessions that way before. I'm sorry if I've done anything to offend someone. Or I'm sorry, I want to make a confession today, but I wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for somebody else doing this to me. That's not the way this works. Personal responsibility. The Bible teaches personal responsibility. Be responsible, and Paul is big on that.
It also speaks to the power of sin, though, because you see Paul here saying, the sin caused him to do things that, when he's looking back at it, and even in the moment, he knew was wrong, and that confirmed the goodness of the law. You also see over in like Luke 15 where Jesus talks about the prodigal son, and in verse 17 it says, when he came to himself. So he had given himself over to sin. He got himself in such a bad condition. But finally he came to himself and said, you know what? My father's servants have more than what I enjoy, more than what I do now. And it got him to the point where he had to just realize, this sin is destroying my life.
Sin is powerful. Sin, temptation. And I talk about this every week too. Temptation today is far stretching. It reaches wide and it touches everybody. If you have a phone, as I do, that's my Bible. That's what I use. I have a phone. Everybody has a phone these days. You can go on that phone and you can find anything you want. Anything you want is there. You can be scrolling through one of your social media pages, and every single sin, every single thing that you could imagine, the devil is there working in it, and he sees it, and he knows what will work on you, and you will find it. Why? Because evil is always in a war against good. That Satan will always try to find who he can devour. Sin will eat you up. Yes, sir.
I think it's fascinating. When you look at verse 15, to put it all in context, for what I will do, that I do not practice, but what I hate. And so it speaks to the power of sin. The things that we hate is what we're doing. And there's a certain amount of perplexity in Paul's speech where it's like, I can't even figure this out. Why do I do the things I hate to do? And when you look at the audience, which is obviously Roman, the Roman people, and in verse 24 where it says, who will deliver me from this body of death? Which is a reference to a form of execution that the Romans, there were several different types of execution that the Romans would use. And so, who will deliver me from this body of death where they would chain? If you were being executed, one form of it is they would chain a dead body to you. And anyone that removed the chains so that you could get rid of this dead body would also be executed as well. And so, if you have a dead, rotting heart physically chained to you in time, what's that going to do to you? Through the course of decay, and just all the things that we can imagine that are disgusting, right? It kills us. And so the point is, what he was saying to the Romans is that, hey, there is no way you possess the ability to separate yourself from this power of sin. You just don't. And to glorify Jesus to say that he does. Who will save you from Jesus?
Yes, that's important because he's using Jesus Christ as that salvation. As our salvation is the exact same. Our salvation comes through the grace of Jesus Christ, right? The grace of God gave His Son to die on a cross that we could have salvation, that we have a chance to be saved. We have an opportunity to do what's right. Josh, yes, sir.
Thinking along the lines of how powerful sin is, and how we're always trying to make excuses, but so and so made me do this. That's been going on forever. It reminds me of Ecclesiastes 1:9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. From the very beginning, Adam and Eve, when God confronted them, well, the woman that you gave me made me do it. And for the snake deceived me. We've always been trying to put blame on somebody else. And the devil is not dumb. He knows how to get us. And he tries to go after us. But knowing that there's nothing new. The same practices that the devil used in the garden, he still uses today. That if we read our Bible and we see these strategies that the devil uses, how he tries to get us, we can learn from it. We can anticipate it. And we can see, hey, this path that I'm on is not the right path to keep me going with God. It's comforting.
Oh, yeah, and you can see that. It's been around forever. Blame has been around. But like Jason was saying just a minute ago, when you come to that realization, right? You come to that realization that, hey, wait a minute. I'm not doing right. There has to be a change. And see, that's another thing that some people use this for, is to say, it don't matter what you do. It don't matter how you live. You're saved anyway. You're saved. Christ saved you no matter what you do, no matter what happens, you're okay. And that's not in any way what this is teaching. It's teaching us that there's a new way, there's a new gospel. But it's not saying there's nothing you have to do. It's not saying that there's not any law. It's saying there's a new law, there's a new gospel, there's a new way. It doesn't relieve you from having to do what's right. It doesn't relieve you from living in sin. The explanation that Paul's trying to give is your fleshly body could never live up to the old law. You could never do all of the things that you needed to do in that old law. That's why it's flawed. There's a new way. The new way is through Christ. But we still have to obey His commandments. We still have to do what's right. We still have to follow the gospel. Because without it, we're still back in that same sin that we were in before. You can't just walk away from the sin for a little while and then introduce it back into your life little by little, because before long you're right back where you were to begin with, in an unsaved situation, in an unsaved manner. And each of us will answer for that at judgment. When we're forgiven of the sins that we've done, we're forgiven of them. They're wiped out. It's a new day. You're written back into the Lamb's Book of Life. Your name is there again.
Paul also talks here about inner self and outer self, and how his inner self knows that God's law is good, and his inner self wants to do what's right. That's his conscience. That's what he's learned, what he knows in his heart is right. But then his outer self is still not strong enough to always do the right things. But his inner self is confirming that God's law is good, because when he does those things that he hates, he feels remorse, he feels regret. He knows what he's done is not right. So there's this constant battle going on between what he knows in his heart is right, what he knows in his heart is God's law, and what his, like you mentioned, his flesh tends to want to do.
Yeah, so you can see that in verse 20. even after all the things that he's trying to do, and all of the good that he wants to do, and all of the good that he's doing, sin still gets in the way. And stumbling blocks. We're going to have those. We're going to see things like that. What we can't do is we can't forget that we are on a narrow path. We can't forget that we're on a narrow way. Oftentimes, it's easier to take the wide road, to take the wide way, because it's easier. It's an easier path. If you're walking through the woods and you see and you come up onto a fork in the road or a fork in the pathway, this way's wide and has been trodden many times. It's huge. It's an easy pathway to get where you're going. This way's not traveled as much. It's more narrow, and it's a harder climb. Human nature wants you to make you want to go that way, right? Go that easy way. God never said it's going to be easy. God never said that being a Christian was an easy life, but He promised you something. I've said this before. He never promised you a smooth flight, but He did promise you a safe landing. All of your work will be rewarded in the end. Yes, sir.
Somebody might have been addicted to this or addicted to that. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to struggle with that later on. And we all need help. We can't do it on our own. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And that's, I didn't mean no means meant that we can live a pure life, because it's not, Jesus lived a pure life. No one else has. We all sin and fall short of the glory. We know that. But we can't dwell in that sin. You're going to have mix-ups, you're going to have mess-ups, you're going to have stumbles, you're going to have times that happens. That's why this is so important, why the new gospel is so important, why Jesus is so important, because we have forgiveness of that. We can ask for that forgiveness, and I know that everyone here says their prayers. We say you pray about it. Every time you pray, you should be praying for the forgiveness of sin, because you need it. Because there's willful sin, which is returning back to that life, going back and living in that sin. And then there's the unwillful sin that happens, and you get forgiveness for that, and you ask for forgiveness for that. It's like going ahead, knowing something's not right, knowing that you know you shouldn't do it, you do it anyway. Then you ask for forgiveness for it because you knew ahead of time that it was okay because you could get forgiveness. That's not what Paul wants to portray here. He's trying to say that you're dead to that life. You don't dwell in that sin anymore. Yes, there are going to be temptations. Yes, there are going to be times that you stumble. Yes, there will be times that you fall. But you have to get back up. If you stay there, then the eraser comes out. And you're removed from that Lamb's Book of Life. You are separated from Christ. People fail to understand that. And it does seek in and it sneaks in into the church. It gets in where you start allowing little things to happen. Like I said before, the cracks. Satan knows the cracks. And he will work on the church. He don't care about the world. Satan doesn't care about the world. He doesn't work on them. They're already lost. He goes after us. You know, I had a thing a long time ago I read about a story that the devil was having a meeting with all of his little demons out here. And he was trying to find a way that he could deceive the world. What could get the best? And one of the demons says, we could teach everybody and we can convince everyone that God's not real, that hell's not real and God's not real. Satan said, yeah, that'll work on some of those people. He said, but it ain't going to work on everybody. And he said, well, what can I do? What could we do? And then finally this one sits up and he stands up and he says, what we should do is we'll convince them that they have time. We'll convince the ones in the church and the ones in the world that they have time. That came from a lesson I gave several years ago that my daughter still loves today. It's called It's Okay, I Have Time. One day I hope I can give that to you and let you understand what I'm saying here. The devil convinces people that there's always tomorrow. The devil convinces people that you don't have to be saved today. You can push it off and wait till tomorrow. Evil's there. Satan works in ways that we don't understand. God works in ways that we don't understand. But I promise, you don't have time. Time's not your friend. Salvation is for now. Because when we're convinced that time is going to be there, that tomorrow is going to be there, then that's when we fall back into that old life again. In verse 23 he said, but I see a different law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity under the law of sin which is in my members. So let's go real quick. In verse 25 he says, thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then, on the one hand, I myself with my mind am serving the law of God, but on the other, with my flesh, the law of sin. He's thanking God for the forgiveness. He's thanking God that Jesus Christ has came and bled for us and died for us that we can be saved. If you take that away this morning, that's what you need to take away from this, is Christ is the avenue for our salvation. Don't put off till tomorrow what needs to be done today. Forgiveness. You can be forgiven. Be forgiven today so that tomorrow is new. Thank you for your time this morning. If there's any questions or comments, if not, I appreciate your time. Thank you.